The age of the earth is far more controversial in the church than creation versus evolution.
Noah's flood is the key event to understanding the age of the earth, and we'll explain why today on Creation Magazine Live.
Welcome to Creation Magazine Live. My name is Calvin Smith.
And I'm Richard Fangrad.
And our topic this week is the age of the earth.
Yes.
And how important it is to understand this relationship between this controversial issue, the age of the earth, and the global flood of Noah as recorded in Genesis.
Yeah. I interviewed one of our geologists years ago, Dr. Emil Silvestru, former atheist evolutionist. He got his PhD. He's one of the world's leaders in the geology of caves. How caves form in limestones, you have acid
karstology.
rain and karstology.
Yes.
Yeah, it's the technical word for it, or the official word. But he was an atheist. He got his PhD as an evolutionist, as an atheist, and we did this interview for an article that's up on our website. And I asked him this question: what was the turning point in your thinking on the age of the earth? Because today he's obviously a young Earth creationist.
Yeah.
And he said this: the geologist in me recognized very quickly that the key event in Genesis was Noah's flood, the ultimate geological event. If there really was a worldwide flood, then the vast majority of sediments and fossils that we see today could have been its outcome. And this made the idea of deep geological time, millions of years, usually associated with such sediments, irrelevant.
Wow. What a turnaround.
So he understood the significance of the age of the earth and the global flood, the relationship between the two.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think people might still be wondering, what's the connection here between geology, millions of years, the flood, all these kinds of things. But the idea of millions of years was made popular by reinterpreting the history in Genesis. I mean, up to about 200 years ago in the Western world, if you ask somebody, hey, look at all those rock layers, all those dead things in there, fossils, how'd that get here? They go, well, it says right here in Genesis that there was a global flood.
Noah's flood,
and everything that wasn't on the ark, that wasn't preserved, would have been, destroyed in the deluge, right? All the water would have mixed up with all the sediments, all the biomass mixed together. What would you expect to find? Well, at the end of this event, there would have been, billions of dead things, right? Their fossil remains found in sedimentary, waterborne layers, and there would have been piles of it because it was a year-long event, et cetera, et cetera. But that started to get changed around late 1700s. People like James Hutton started to say, no, maybe these rock layers can be reinterpreted. What if Genesis isn't real? What if the Bible's not real? Is basically what he was saying.
Yes.
Then how would you explain all these rock layers? And so, of course, that got picked up by people like Charles Lyell. And he championed the concept of uniformitarianism. Forget the idea of a sudden, quick deposition of all this stuff.
Yeah, let's ditch Noah's flood and get rid of the Bible and
invent a new history.
Invent a new history, yeah.
Right,
yeah.
And so to do that, of course, if you don't have a sudden rapid event, one that was huge, you would have to have slow events that would build these things up. And actually, things like radioisotope dating or distant starlight, none of that was thought up. Back then it was like, okay, well, volcanoes, or valley erosion, or just the sediments themselves. These were arguments that Long Agers used to basically dethrone the concept of a global flood.
Yeah,
so that's why Noah's flood and the age of the earth is such an important link.
Yeah, so if the flood didn't cover the whole world and it didn't lay down the world's sedimentary rock, then all those sediments must have been laid down over millions of years.
That's right.
So that's how all these things come together. On the other hand, if the flood did happen the way the Bible says it happened, then it is responsible for laying down the rock record and not the millions of years.
Right.
So that's the relationship between these two, and that's why it's such a key to understanding the whole issue of the age of the earth.
Right.
The flood is the crucial element in understanding this issue.
In his second letter, the Apostle Peter links Jesus' second coming and judgment of the whole world to the historical reality of Noah's flood. He prophesied, In the last days, scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, "Where is this coming he promised?" But they deliberately forget that long ago by God's word the heavens existed, and the earth was formed out of water and by water. By these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. And Genesis is clear. The words all, every, everything and entire are used 8 times in chapter 7 to describe what was covered or destroyed by the flood. Genesis 7:23 says every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. In the same way the flood was real and global, so too will the second coming of Jesus be real and the whole world be judged.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
And we're back. We're talking this week about the relationship between a global flood, the millions of years, and geology. So and it's a critical relationship to understand these things to make sense of the issue of the age of the earth. That's what we're talking about, the age of the earth, on Creation Magazine Live this week.
Exactly. Now, what does the Bible say about the nature of the flood?
Yes.
Right? We're going to go to Genesis 7:19-20. God's talking about the waters prevailing on the earth. He says, and the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heavens were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. So, this certainly seems to be talking about a global flood here, not a local flood. I mean, some people have said, well, the word all doesn't have to mean all in all circumstances. Well, that's true. You can look in the word all in some of the New Testament passages, but in context, it clearly means, when it says, all the whole world. Well, it's talking about the Roman world. You got to think of it in context, right? Okay. But not only when we look at this verse does it say all the high mountains were covered, but it says all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered to a depth of more than 20 feet.
All-inclusive type of statements.
Oh, well, yeah, you're doubling it up. You're saying it twice for emphasis, so to speak.
And then if, there's Christians that have bought into the notion of millions of years because it's a very popular notion.
Right.
And they're then forced to say that Noah's flood was a local event, that it wasn't global. Right. So if you have millions of years or you have a global flood to explain the sedimentary layers, you can't have both. And they recognize that. They've bought into the millions of years. But if the flood was local, why build an ark? I mean,
you got over 100 years to build this thing.
You got over 100 years to move.
Exactly.
God told Abraham to move, but why not just move?
Right.
Why? That's the easy thing to do.
Yeah, exactly.
If it's a local flood.
And why build this boat so big that it's capable of taking 2 of every, 7 of some land-dwelling, air-breathing animals on board? Because again, not only could you just move, but you're assuming that if this is a local flood, that even the creatures that are here are represented by similar creatures outside of the flood area.
Right. Yeah.
So what do you need to take them on board for anyway? For a year, you're going to float around on this barge with a bunch of animals. Meanwhile, there's other animals of the same type already living outside of the flood area. So
the ark had the capacity to take representatives of all the kinds that were there originally to get the millions of species we have today. It had the capacity to do that. Why would you why would you have to do that if it was a local flood? Why take birds? Noah was commanded to take birds. I mean, if it's a local flood, birds get up and fly away if it's a local flood.
That's right. I mean, some birds can, migrate for thousands of kilometers.
Yes.
So obviously, they can go around the world. They don't need to do that. How about the rainbow covenant?
Yeah.
God said at the end of the flood that he would, there's a rainbow that appears and he says, never again will I, that's a sign that never again will I send a flood to destroy the whole earth. Well, if you're going to say that was a local flood, well, there's been...
God would have lied.
Yeah, because there's been tons of local floods since then.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
the main purpose of the flood was as a judgment on sin, of course.
Right.
And a local flood theory implies that the North American Aboriginals, the natives of Africa, the Scandinavians, the Chinese, etc., weren't judged, weren't affected by the flood. They escaped God's judgment on sin.
Right. Those that were outside the area of wherever this local flood was, they wouldn't have got judged.
They wouldn't have got judged. If so, what could Christ possibly have meant when he likened the coming judgment of all people to the judgment of all people at the time of Noah?
Right, because it's going to be a global judgment.
Yes.
Again.
Scripture falls apart if the flood wasn't global.
Yeah. And what about the duration of the flood? Everyone seems to know about the 40 days and 40 nights of rain,
Yes,
right?
yeah,
and
that's
all that
very
kind
popular.
of stuff. But there was also 150 days, that's 5 months,
Yeah.
that the water covered the earth, and then after that began retreating, right? We've got 2.5 months after that the tops of the mountains became visible.
So that's like 7.5 months now.
Right.
So
And they're on the ark for a total of 371 days. I mean, it just screams global flood.
it does. I mean, that doesn't sound, how can a local flood last that long? And you have all those other just logical inconsistencies, things that don't work. The text of Scripture and all of the other things that are there, just logically, it was a global flood.
Exactly.
And a global flood would have laid down those sediments. We'll say more about that in a few minutes.
Richard Van Grad and Calvin Smith also host a fast-paced and informal internet-based video program called Genesis Unleashed. These faith-building teaching videos feature responses to news articles, summaries of articles on creation.com, interviews, and answers to some of the most asked questions about the creation-evolution issue and the most attacked book of the Bible, Genesis. Visit creation.com's media center to view or subscribe to the latest video content.
Welcome back. This week we're talking about the age of the earth and understanding the age of the earth issue. Without an understanding of what a global flood would do to the earth, you'll never fully understand how science supports biblical creation. It really is that critical.
It is.
Yep.
I mean, the flood enables us to properly understand things like canyon systems, like the Grand Canyon, for
Sure.
example,
Yep.
which is commonly used to promote millions of years. Mountains, extensive layers of basalt and sedimentary rock, and the fossil record. Most evolutionists convinced that the fossil record proves evolution have never seriously considered the question, what would a global flood do? I mean, if you just erase that and you don't think about it, then of course you're never going to recognize that what we see reflects what the flood did, because you don't
Right.
doesn't even enter into your mind. Right?
And many Christians haven't thought of it, haven't really asked that question either.
That's true. For example, a commenter on one of our previous shows said this: the fossil column. There is something that we can observe now that proves evolution. It is the sequence of fossils. The fossil column is basically simple progressing to complex. It starts with just microbes on the very bottom layers, then shellfish and worms, etc. near the bottom layers. And going up the strata, we get the first invertebrates and then land invertebrates and the first vertebrates. Then going higher, we get the first land vertebrates and then the first mammals, then more advanced mammals, and near the top we get apes and us. Combined fossil sites all over the world show this sequence. If evolution isn't true, what else could make it like that? How could your flood do that? There's evidence for evolution we can see now. It's the fossil sequence in the strata. Total proof of evolution and debunks creationism. The flood can't make a perfect family tree sequence like that just by chance. No way. And that's the perception most people have, right? That's what they were taught in school. You got this neat order, progressing from simple to complex, and
Yes.
you know, a flood would just mix things up.
Yeah. Well, to respond to that, moving water has a tremendous ability to sort things by size, by shape, and by buoyancy. You can sort out the different grains and of sediment and so on,
Right, for
to
example,
sort
yeah.
into different layers, and anything else that the floodwaters would sweep along. It's basically everything on the surface of the earth.
Yeah.
So what would a global flood do? Well, the first things buried, we would expect, if you ask that question, what would a global flood do? The first things that would be buried would be things at the bottom of the ocean.
Right. They're already there.
Ocean bottom dwelling creatures, and then it would go up, the fish, and then amphibians, and then reptiles living near the wetlands and so on, and the lowlands, and then you'd go up to mammals eventually last. We would expect a general pattern to the fossil record. That would be expected if there was a global flood, but we would not expect a neat ordered sequence that so many people perceive the fossil record as.
Right.
But that's
I mean, what we'd expect from a flood is exactly what scientists find. And for
Yes.
more detail, you can go to creation.com, fossils, wrong place, to learn about that. By the way, 95% of the fossils we find are marine invertebrates, right? Clams.
Yeah.
Basically, it's clams from bottom to top there.
Yeah, there's this perception that the fossil record is all, fish and dinosaurs and that kind of thing.
Right.
Now note that most of the animals living before the flood would have just vanished.
Right.
There's this perception that, well, all of those animals were
Would have been
preserved as
preserved.
fossils.
Right.
No, the fossilization requires rapid burial and then other factors as well. Most of the animals would have just decomposed.
Right.
They would have just died. What is remarkable is the global evidence for rapid burial. That's what's remarkable.
Yeah.
That soft tissue is preserved. That's remarkable. In those cases, the organism must have been buried extremely quickly before that soft tissue had a chance to decompose.
That's right. Look at these pictures. Here's some interesting fossils. A fossil octopus and a fossil jellyfish. You can see the artist's reconstruction there too. How could these creatures have been preserved given the evolutionist slow and gradual scenario? Right?
Yeah, it doesn't. That soft tissue obviously would have decomposed, and you wouldn't see those fossils. You wouldn't be making those observations if it was laid down over millions of years.
I mean, near where I live in Guelph, Ontario, down near the Niagara Escarpment, a place called Dundas.
Yeah.
Went down there one time. You can go fossil hunting. I'm looking at 100 meters of the Niagara Escarpment exposed, right? And I come across this plaque, and it said, you know, an evolutionary interpretation of these strata.
Of course.
And it said that 100 meters got laid down in 50 million years. So I thought, okay, well, let's do the calculation.
Do the math.
How long would it take to lay down a centimeter of rock according to their calculations? Well, the calculation is 5,000 years. It's going to take 5,000 years to make that much rock if you go with the slow, steady deposition.
Uniformitarianism.
Right.
Yeah.
And so if you got a jellyfish laying there, jellyfish even dead, it's got to be at least a centimeter thick. You think it's going to sit there for 5,000 years?
Yeah.
You know, so obviously it just doesn't work by what we're observing, right? The observations immediately say, no, that uniformitarian slow processes that, you know, Lyle proposed, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, yeah. Observations like these, like soft tissue preservation and so on, it just screams against the need for millions of years and for a global flood. There's powerful evidence there in what scientists are finding. We simply cannot explain the world around us by observing deposition and erosion rates today and pretending that they have always been the same.
Exactly.
That's not going to explain what scientists are seeing.
I mean, we've shown this before, but here's, you know, some more problems. Here's some pictures of tree-like plants extending through multiple layers, polystrate fossils. Again, you're not going to get a dead tree or plant standing upright as the rate of sedimentation comes in at, you know, 5,000 years per centimeter. So huge problems for the evolutionary story. Great support for the flood, and we'll look at more when we get back.
In recent years, NASA probes have sent back images of our nearest planet, Mars. These images have prompted some scientists to suggest that a global flood once carved the Martial landscape, even though no liquid water has yet been found. The Bible records an event that certainly sounds like a global flood on Earth. Genesis records that all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. Jesus himself, referring to those not on Noah's Ark, said, "The flood came and took them all away." Unlike the elusive water on Mars, water covers 70% of the Earth's surface, and water-deposited sedimentary rock covers much of the land surface. So isn't it strange that many people who are open to the possibility of a global flood on Mars, despite the absence of water, immediately dismiss any suggestion that a global flood occurred on Earth?
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
Our subject today is the key to understanding how God created recently, which is the global flood, right? And once you understand that, you understand what the flood did geologically, it helps you understand the surface features that we see on the earth today and puts it in the context of a recent creation.
Yeah, without a global flood that accelerated geologic processes, the things we see today like huge amounts of sedimentation, mountain building, massive erosion, continental drift, etc., probably would take millions of years. Those features probably would take millions of years at today's rates to form.
Right.
But a flood can accomplish those things very quickly. For example, plate tectonics. We did a show on this a couple of years ago, actually. If you want to have a look at that, it's creation.com/CML2-07, back in season 2. There's a lot of evidence that the continents have moved.
Right.
They've moved apart. There's the fit of the continents, and there's many other lines of evidence that indicate that. But if you just use the rates we see happening today, like the amount that the Atlantic Ocean is opening up and so on, it would take millions of years. But a flood can accomplish those things very, very quickly. And that's what that show is on. If you've got questions about that, have a look at that show.
Yeah, actually, there's some big problems with the slow and gradual version of plate tectonics anyway.
Yes.
The show we did on this follows the research done by the world's leading plate tectonic modeler, geophysicist Dr. John Baumgartner. And his model, which has been duplicated by other researchers, verifies that plate tectonics can happen rapidly, not slowly, right?
Right. So based on the best science we have today, rapid plate tectonics was a part of the flood.
Right.
Opening up the continents and explaining those observations. So then it didn't take millions of years. Obviously.
Right.
By the way, this model suggests not only lateral movement of the plates, but also vertical movement. One of the questions is, where'd the water come from for a global flood? Well, all you need to do is raise the ocean bottoms a little bit, and presto, you got a global flood.
Exactly.
There's plenty enough water in the oceans today for a global flood.
Another thing that people think takes millions of years is the erosion of mountains, right?
Yes.
For example, the Appalachians are supposedly older than the Rockies because erosion takes a long time, and the Appalachians are more eroded than the Rockies.
Right.
Actually, all you can really say is that they're more eroded. Right? The millions of years doesn't just fall out of that. At the end of the flood, there would be a period of massive erosion, right? As
Yes.
on the continents, when water flows, into the deepening ocean basins, the Earth's rising up like that. So the Appalachian area had more erosion. Okay, time isn't required, right?
It doesn't need millions of years.
No, a global flood explains massive erosion.
Yeah. Many challenges to biblical geology, or flood geology, let's say, have been answered in this article here. You'll want to check this out. Geology and a Young Earth, creation.com/geolye. Well, you can see it there on the screen. But finely layered strata is often touted as taking a long time to deposit, one fine layer a year.
Right.
And that's taught to school children. It's in the textbooks and so on. There's a great article on creation.com called Sedimentation Experiments, Nature Finally Catches Up.
Yeah, Nature Magazine.
Nature Magazine. And this is where researchers who published in Nature, and that Nature is probably the world's leading science magazine, that duplicated 10-year-old research, creationist research, it was 10 years old at the time, on sedimentation. The result? When water's moving along, different grain sizes of sediment will settle out in distinct layers.
Exactly what you were explaining earlier.
Yeah. And if you want to have a look at that, some amazing research there, creation.com/sednature. So fine layering is explained by a global flood as well.
Living fossils, that's another evidence against millions of years. And we did a show on this just a couple of weeks ago, and you can see that at creation.com, CML4-05. 432 mammal species found in dinosaur-aged rock, right? So there wasn't an age of dinosaurs. When we look at what was actually buried together, again, it supports the concept of a global flood. They're all buried at the same time. They all lived at the same time, and many of the fossils look identical to the animals that are living today. So what does that mean? No evolution, right?
Yeah.
So again, a global flood is a superior explanation for what scientists are finding in the rocks.
Yeah. Another one, flood stories. There's another powerful evidence for a global flood, is the stories from cultures around the world that are similar to the Genesis account. Many of the details are similar between the accounts. You can see a chart here comparing the different flood stories and see the similarities between all of them. Skeptics are sure that the Gilgamesh epic is the original and Moses copied the flood account. Here's just one thing, just one little thing to make a distinction. The Gilgamesh Ark in the Gilgamesh epic is a 9-story cube. Naval engineers, anyways, for more information, go to creation.com/Gilgamesh to see the original account there and compare the two. We'll be right back.
The reason that the Creation Answers book is so popular is because it covers a huge range of topics and answers more than 60 of the most asked questions about Genesis and the creation evolution issue. Questions like, what is the evidence for God's existence? Could the days in Genesis 1 be long periods of time? How did all the animals fit on Noah's Ark? Does radioisotope dating prove that the Earth is very old? Where do dinosaurs fit into the Bible? And many more. To order your copy, visit creation.com.
Okay, we've been talking about the key really to unlocking the whole age of the Earth dilemma for people.
Yep.
It's a global flood, and we've got a ton of resources at creation.com. You can go to our web store there, and we'd like to encourage you to check out this DVD by Taz Walker, PhD in geology from our Australian office. It's called Biblical Geology, Properly Understanding the Rocks. And you can either get a DVD or you can get a digital download of this, and you can actually get it at 50% off. If you just go to our website, use the code CMLBG, you can get Dr. Walker's Biblical Geology for 50% off, and it really help you to understand what we've been talking about here. Now, we're going to go to some feedback. Often get feedback from people, either because of our videos or some of our articles, etc. And this one's called Black Sea Flood Mistake. And this is a fellow from Ontario, Canada. And actually, Dr. Walker responds to him, but I'll read his initial comments here. Why could not this Black Sea flood been a part of the biblical global flood? The scientists may be saying otherwise, but I see this as evidence that there was a biblical global flood, and this little area is just one part that is affected. To dismiss that aspect by you, I think, is wrong. Hopefully other sites will be found around the globe, and that in turn will give more proof of the biblical account. Thank you.
That's the account. So the Black Sea, if you, in case you haven't heard of this, it was in the news years ago. This is very old feedback from in the 90s, and there was some layers of sedimentary rock there, and some geologists thought, hey, this is the flood of Noah. This is the itty bitty little flood that was found, in the Black Sea area, and so on. But it's kind of like you can't see the forest for the trees.
Right.
All of the sedimentary rock in that area is from, we would say, or maybe not all of it, but the great majority of it,
the vast majority,
is from the flood. All around the world, the flood was a global flood, as we've just spent the last half hour talking about.
Yeah, and it's not just that one area that has sedimentary layers. It's the planet. Everything we see, everywhere you go, you find fossils in sedimentary layers.
Yeah, everywhere. I mean, and it's deposited. There's different thicknesses, right? Like we're here in kind of southern Ontario in Canada recording these shows, and there's a couple hundred feet of sedimentary rock beneath the studio here. And then if we go further north, you get to the Canadian Shield, where the sedimentary rock goes to zero. Yep. You're right on and we would understand that to be the day 3 created rocks. Like that's the foundation. The foundational rocks that God would have created on day 3. But there's no flood deposited rocks there. Right. You go to the Middle East, on the other hand, and there's not just feet, but miles of flood deposited sedimentary rocks containing oil. Right. And then all kinds of other stuff there. So
basically what's happening with Christians is the flood of Noah always tries to get naturalized, just like everything else in the Bible by many people,
that's
right?
Part of it.
Because when people hear of flood stories, cultures all over the world having flood stories, they have to explain it somehow. Well, there was this event that happened and stuff, but it couldn't have been the biblical event. So we're just going to say this is how that biblical story got started. It was just a little one. And then what happens is sometimes Christians are watching, TV shows or whatever, and they go, oh, okay, and they buy into that as evidence that the Bible's true somehow. But the whole point of the show was to show you how the Bible wasn't true. So why should Christians buy into these naturalistic explanations? Right?
Yeah. Again, it's kind of like you can't see the forest for the trees. Yes, that was part of the global flood, and so is everything else. Right. But there's so much more information. This show is called Creation Magazine Live. We want to give you a free sample copy, a digital copy of Creation Magazine. Go to creation.com/freemag. creation.com/freemag, and you can get a sample of Creation Magazine on which this show is based. Right. So come on back next week, same time, same channel.